Farouk, thank you very
Yes.
much for that warm and generous introduction. I wish I could be giving this talk in your beautifully appointed Khaki lab. I wish I could be in Bombay. It's certainly one of my favorite cities in India. But unfortunately, I'm not. I'm giving you this talk from a farmhouse about 3 hours out of Sydney. And it's a very long way from Jaipur and Hyderabad, the two princely states that I'll be talking about today. And look, rather than giving you a history lesson, I want to go behind the scenes, giving you a more of a personal story about my encounter with the royal families of those two states, and some background which shines light on their stories and how they've managed or mismanaged the transition from being rulers to ordinary people, if there is such a thing. Let's begin in Hyderabad. In pre-independence India, Hyderabad was India's second largest state by area, slightly smaller than Kashmir, but the largest in terms of population. It was also the richest thanks to its agricultural produce and the fact that it sat on the largest deposits of diamonds in the world. Now, over 7 generations from 1724 to 1948, the Nizams created a state that would rival Mecca in importance as a center for Islamic learning and eclipse Constantinople as a repository for the Islamic world's cultural and spiritual legacy. Hyderabad, I'm just getting a message that my internet connection is a bit unstable. I'm sorry about that. I've got a satellite connection here because I'm a long way from anywhere, but please bear with me. I'm hoping that it'll become a little bit better. Now, Hyderabad as a state emerged following the chaos that followed the death of Aurangzeb, the great Mogul's burial near Daulatabad in 1707 touched off a debilitating struggle that saw son conspire against son, puppet against pretender, often with murderous consequences. In the course of a dozen years, no fewer than 17 aspirants would jockey for the throne. Now, the first emerging out of that chaos was this man, Kamaruddin, better known as Nizam or Mulk, a man of Perso-Turkic descent and an ex-general in Aurangzeb's army, who in 1712 became the viceroy of the Deccan and then the founder of the Asaf Jahi dynasty. The inauguration of the first Nizam, as its leaders became known, took place behind closed doors in a private ceremony attended by the new ruler's closest advisors. Asaf Jahi I never formally declared his independence and insisted that his rule was entirely based on the trust reposed in him by the Mughal emperor, to whom he swore eternal loyalty. His faithfulness to the Mughal court was unwavering and would be passed down through the generations that followed. The Nizam's dominions yielded an income that was almost equal to the rest of the Mughal empire, yet there was no throne, no crown, and no symbol of sovereignty. Coins were still minted with the emperor's name until 1858. Just days before he died, Asaf Jahi I dictated his last will and testament. The 17-clause document was a blueprint for governance and personal conduct that arranged from advice on how to keep the troops happy and well-fed to an apology for neglecting his wife. He urged fiscal restraint. Keep the treasury with you wherever you go, so that whenever the army gets restive, their arrears can be paid off. There is enough money in the treasury to last 7 generations, if properly spent. Finally, he insisted, you must not lend your ears to tittle-tattle of the backbiters and slanderers, nor suffer the riffraff to approach your presence. Having dictated his will, Nizam-ul-Mulk summoned his second son, Nasir Jung, his wives and chief nobles to his bedside, said his prayers, and died aged 77. Unfortunately, his successors would heed little, if any, of his advice. As I said, I don't want to give you a history lesson, in the princely state of Hyderabad from its foundation until now. If you need to find out more about the second through to the sixth Nizams, please buy my book and read it. But I do want to say more about this man, Osman Ali Khan, the seventh Nizam of Hyderabad. Now, Osman Ali Khan is a fascinating character. Official histories of Hyderabad published during his lifetime state he was born in Purani Haveli on the 6th of April, 1886, but they become a little bit vague after that. In reality, he was born out of wedlock to a concubine from his father's well-stocked zanana. He was 24 when Mahbub Ali Khan suddenly died from meningitis in 1911. Like his father, Osman Ali Khan established a sizable zanana. The number of his wives varied from around 200 in the 1920s to 42 at the time of his death in 1967. Despite British fears that he would be an ineffectual ruler, Osman Ali Khan embarked on a series of far-reaching reforms. One of his first farmans, or directives, was an order restraining Hyderabad's eunuchs from luring fresh recruits into their ranks to stem an alarming rise in their numbers. He then banned the institution of devadasis and outlawed some of the more indulgent pastimes enjoyed by Hyderabad's Nawabs, such as cockfighting and bullfights. On the fiscal front, the Nizam undertook measures to rein in the expenditure of the nobility, known as the Paigas, by confiscating their lands. They responded in the time-honored fashion of plotting against the Nizam and spreading stories that he drank heavily and was involved in all kinds of debauchery. There was an element of truth in some of these stories. Osman Ali Khan's preferred beverages were invalid port and French champagne, but he was also an accomplished ballroom dancer and would hold lavish parties in the King Koti Palace, where Anglo-Indian jazz bands played his favorite tunes, I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles and Whisperings. He was also a loyal servant of the empire, donating soldiers and money when the First World War broke out, even though the British and their allies were fighting the remnants of another Muslim dynasty, the Ottomans. In 1917, the British rewarded the Nizam by conferring on him the title Most Faithful Ally of the British Empire. He became the only Indian prince to be referred to as His Exalted Highness. Hyderabad was also one of just four states entitled to receive a 21-gun salute, the others being Kashmir, Baroda, and Gwalior. Today, Osman Ali Khan is remembered for being one of the richest people in the world. His private estate, which comprised 30% of the land in the Nizam's dominions, gave him an income of 25 million rupees a year. He had also inherited from his father untold amounts of jewelry, bulk pearls, kilograms of cut and uncut diamonds, gold in the form of coinage and bullion measured by the ton, and enough cash for most of it to lie unnoticed in cellars where it was nibbled by rats. To the wider masses, however, Osman Ali Khan was determined to show a very different side of his character. He publicly abhorred the use of any goods that were not produced in Hyderabad. He would only smoke cheap, locally made, filterless charminars, which were described as the most wretched of cigarettes in the world. He was so obsessive about allowing nothing to go to waste that he scrawled instructions and even drafted legally binding farmans on the inside of his empty cigarette packets. His tendency to wear simple cotton pajamas, except for official events, prompted one British resident to describe him as resembling a, quote, snuffly old clerk, too old to be sacked. At state banquets paid for by the public purse, guests ate from gold plates and drank wine in gold goblets. But when an invitation came for tea in private, he would carefully count out the number of biscuits he served to his guests. Osman Ali Khan was fast becoming known as the Howard Hughes of India, a fabulously wealthy but miserly man who had sold his father's women for 30 rupees and haggled over the price of mangoes. Osman Ali Khan had two sons by his wife Dulan Pasha, Azam and Moazzam. This is a photo of Azam. As a result of their pampered upbringing, they behaved like brats. On their first trip to Europe in the late 1920s, they flirted outrageously with women, refused to pay bills, and spent their money at casinos and on expensive cars. Around this time, the leader of the Khilafat movement in India, Shaukat Ali, urged the Nizam to arrange for the brothers to be married to the daughter and niece of Abdul Majid, the former caliph, who had been sent into exile by Ataturk. Sophisticated, smart, and cosmopolitan, Durdasheva and her niece Niloufar were the exact opposite of Azam and Moazzam. Despite this, they were married in Nice in southern France in 1931. You can imagine the culture shock the brides experienced when they first came to India, particularly after the British resident discovered that Dulan Pasha had wanted to poison them. Osman Ali Khan cared little for all of this. The question of who among the rulers of the Muslim world would succeed Abdul Majid as caliph and therefore command the allegiance of millions of Muslims had far-reaching geopolitical implications. The Nizam believed that the offspring of the union between his eldest son Azam and Abdul Majid's daughter Durdasheva would grow up to become the leader of the Muslim world, his legitimacy set in stone by a lineage that on his father's side could be traced back 34 generations to the first caliph of Islam, Abu Bakr, and on his mother's side to the Prophet Muhammad himself. This is Mukram Jah as an infant with his mother Durdasheva. He was born on the 7th of October 1933 in Nice. I met Jah in his two-bedroom flat in Antalya in southern Turkey, where he was living incognito back in 2005. He was an intensely private man, and to say that getting access to him was difficult would be an understatement. I was given only 4 days to interview him, but after that time it was decided that it was safe to leave us to our own devices, and Jah and I spent a couple of extra days exploring the back roads and Roman ruins of southern Turkey. I was intrigued by the man and his story. Here was a person who was still revered by some Muslims as the caliph, who inherited what was at the time one of the largest fortunes in the world, who turned down offers of ambassadorships from Nehru, who could have made a career in politics and could have done what so many other ruling princes did, namely take control of his remaining properties and turn them into hotels or go into business. Instead, he turned his back on his heritage and his country to drive bulldozers through the Australian desert, and in the process squandered what was one of the largest fortunes in the world. Apportioning blame for what happened is not straightforward. In the late 19th century, the Times of London described Hyderabad as, quote, perhaps the greatest hotbed of intrigue in all of India, unquote. When Jah came to the throne in 1967, little, if anything, had changed. And when it came to adjusting to the new realities of India, where princely titles mattered for little, Jah was supremely ill-equipped, even if he prided himself on being a bit of a misfit. To me, the fact that Jah had spent very little time in Hyderabad was a contributing factor. As I mentioned, he was born in Nice and then brought to India as an infant. Most of his schooling was at Harrow in England. Like the offspring of many Oriental potentates, he went to Cambridge and Sandhurst, where he graduated as an officer in the engineering corps. In 1958, he married Ezra Bergen, who came from an aristocratic Turkish family, and the couple settled down in London. When in 1967 he returned to Hyderabad to find his grandfather on his deathbed, Jah had spent at most a dozen years living in India. Not only did he find himself the sole heir to his grandfather's fortune, he'd inherited a kingdom within a kingdom that his grandfather had created, complete with more than 15,000 staff on the books and around 100 aging concubines from his grandfather's harem. The list of palaces, forts, and havelis ran to more than 50 pages. There was a treasury that was said to contain more jewels than that of all the other princely states put together, and there were some very disgruntled relatives who believed they had been shortchanged. Foremost among them was his own father, who had been disinherited because of his addiction to gambling and womanizing, among other things. India's tax authorities were breathing down Jar's necks, and 4 years later, Indira Gandhi abolished the privy purses. In the winter of 1972, Jar made his second visit to Australia. He'd fallen in love with the country a few months earlier. The wide open spaces and weathered landscapes reminded him of the Deccan Plateau. The people were generally open and non-judgmental. He had asked his then private secretary to find him a small hobby farm near Perth. Instead, he became the owner of a 500,000-acre Murchison House station, 10 hours drive north of the city. The sheep and cattle farm was bigger than most of India's 9-gun princely states. A single paddock could have accommodated Hyderabad city with room to spare. Jar had always loved tinkering with engines, driving old jeeps, refurbishing boats. Now he could play with his toys without anyone looking over his shoulders. D9 bulldozers bought secondhand, amphibious tanks like the one you see here in this slide, saved from the scrap heap, a decommissioned minesweeper that he converted into a yacht, and an army personnel carrier, to name just a few. Jar loved the anonymity and informality of the Australian outback. It was as far away as one could get from the fawning sycophants who surrounded him whenever he stayed in Hyderabad. For the next quarter of a century, he tried to carve out a durbar in the desert, nurturing dreams of retiring quietly and gracefully as, quote, an old-fashioned gentleman farmer who, through choice of his own, adopted an Australian way of life, unquote, as he told me. His adopted lifestyle, however, came at a cost. Murchison House Station ran at a constant loss, draining his resources. But the main damage was being done in Hyderabad. Jar left the management of his inheritance in the hands of people he thought he could trust, with disastrous consequences. Priceless antiques were pillaged or sold for a fraction of their worth. Jewels were similarly pawned off at international auction houses. Palace lands were being encroached on. His personal life was also in tatters. After taking one look at the farm, Ezra filed for divorce. His second marriage was to a local girl from Perth, Helen Simmons, who converted to Islam and changed her name to Aisha. The fairy tale romance that provided gossip columnists with plenty of fodder turned to tragedy when Helen contracted AIDS in 1987 after an affair with a bisexual man. When she died a few months later, Jar was devastated. By 1990, the slide had become a rout. The pain was being felt in Australia where Jar was unable to pay his bills. An old family friend in Hyderabad, the jeweller Sadruddin Javeri, lent him money and briefly put his affairs in order. But the damage had been done, and in 1996, Murchison House Station and his mansion in Perth were on the market to pay off his debts to Javeri. A financial lifeline came in 2006 when the Indian government paid compensation for the acquisition of the crown jewels of the Nizams, but he had to share the proceeds with 2,500 other claimants, all descended from the harems of his grandfather and great-grandfather. When I interviewed Jar in southern Turkey, he told me he saw his life in terms of kismet, or fate. Fate had willed that Helen should die of AIDS and his finances would collapse, and fate had determined he would never fulfill his dreams of living in Australia. I found him to be a lonely man, cut off from his friends and deeply missing his life in the outback. If Jar were to return to the city where more than half a century ago he was proclaimed the 8th Nizam, he would find much of it changed beyond recognition. The city has more than doubled in size. Under the watchful eye of Princess Ezra, the Falaknuma Palace has been transformed into a luxury hotel. The Charmahala complex, with its rich collection of jewels, textiles, weaponry, and photographs, is now one of the most important museums in the world. At the present time, Jah lives in Istanbul, cared for by a housekeeper and a nurse. Now in his mid-80s, a man once strong enough to lift a jeep by its bumper bar while a companion changed his attire is too frail to travel and rarely receives guests. The last time he went to Hyderabad was in 2012 when he offered prayers at the Mecca Masjid. At 87, it is likely he will ever visit Hyderabad again, unless it is to be buried there. When it comes to stories of dynastic dramas and family tragedies, Jaipur eclipses Hyderabad in many ways. At first glance, you might be forgiven into thinking that my book, The House of Jaipur, is just another romance about royalty, fabulous wealth, beautiful people, and the secrets of their personal lives. But my intention was first and foremost to set the story of Jaipur against the history of India's princely states. The Indian princes ruled over 1/3 of India's population. Therefore, they played a crucial role in creating a nation which was partitioned at independence. More than anything, I wanted to undermine the myth that all the princes were feudal despots, rulers clinging to an outdated tradition of absolute monarchy with servile subjects bound to them by archaic religious ritualism. The early chapters of my book essentially tell two parallel stories, that of Kuch Behar and Jaipur. The two stories converge when Gayatri Devi, who was born in Kuch Behar, became the third wife of Sawai Man Singh, the Maharaja of Jaipur in 1940. I also introduce Gayatri Devi's grandfather, the Maharaja of Baroda, Sayaji Rao, the most progressive ruler of his day. In the early 1900s, Sayaji Rao introduced numerous social reforms, including banning untouchability, child marriage, bigamy, and purdah, and making education for all school-aged children compulsory. He sympathized with the independence movement and is renowned for turning his back on the King Emperor George V at the 1911 Delhi Durbar. In that same year, his daughter, Indira Devi, eloped with the third in line to the throne of the small eastern Indian state of Kuch Behar, rather than agreeing to an arranged marriage with the Maharaja of Gwalior. When her husband, who'd become the ruler shortly after their marriage, prematurely drank himself to death, she became the regent of Kuch Behar and ably managed the state until her eldest son, Jagidipendra, or Baya, as he was known, became the Maharaja. Indira Devi was one of the most liberated and progressive women of her day, refusing to live in purdah and insisting she was up to the task of ruling her state, appointing her own personnel, and managing the state's finances. This was in the face of loudly voiced British disapproval of her numerous affairs and the excessive time she spent gambling in casinos on the French Riviera, hobnobbing with aristocracy, riding horses, and allegedly neglecting her children. One of the most interesting facts I uncovered while researching this book and interviewing numerous people was that Gayatri Devi had an unacknowledged half-sister, Kamala. Kamala was born when Indira had a relationship with a nobleman from Hyderabad named Khusru Jung after her husband had died. And as you can see from this photograph, the resemblance between Gayatri Devi and her half-sister is uncanny. That's his half-sister on the left. I think it's, I hope it's your, that would be Gayatri Devi's right, I think, yes. Anyway, there's a sign there saying official, so it's the lady next to that. And Gayatri Devi, of course, is in the middle. Now, other than being embarrassed by the fact that her mother had a child born out of wedlock, I don't really understand why Gayatri Devi spent her life pretending that Kamala was adopted. especially as the two women were extremely close until Gayatri Devi's death. Now, this Jaipur story starts out quite differently. It begins with the death of Maharaja Madho Singh. Madho Singh did not have an heir, something that is surprisingly common among Rajputs. His adopted heir, Sawai Man Singh II, or Jai, as he became known, came from the small Takana of Isardar. He was born in the same year as Osman Ali Khan became the Nizam of Hyderabad and was just 11 when Madho Singh died. From the beginning, the British took a keen interest in his upbringing to ensure that when he was old enough to become the Maharaja, he would be a responsible ruler. This meant having a say in everything from his education to when he could cohabit with his first wife, Maharaja Kanwa. The Anglicizing program continued, with Jai being sent to Mayo College, which was modelled on the British public school system. This was followed by a year's military training in Britain. Jai's time at Sandhurst, which coincidentally was where Mukram Jha was also trained, but at slightly different times. In fact, much different times. There was several decades between them. Was a turning point in his life. Released from the formalities and intrigues of Jaipur, he learned to have fun. From then on, he led two separate existences. In Jaipur, he was a Hindu monarch. On his annual extensive visits to Britain and Europe, he was welcomed into high society and preoccupied with parties and polo and having affairs with beautiful women. Polo was a big part of the time that he spent there, and throughout much of the 1930s, the Jaipur polo team, which he captained, were the unbeaten world champions. The core of the Jaipur story revolves around the courtship and the marriage of Jai and Gayatri Devi, or Aisha, as I'll be calling her from now on. That's how her friends remember her. They became India's most glamorous royal couple. It's equivalent of the Queen and Prince Philip, or John and Jackie Kennedy. Jai met Aisha in Calcutta in 1931, where he had gone to play polo. He was 19, she was just 12, but she developed a schoolgirl crush on him, which grew into a full-blown romance. It's easy to see why. Jai was the quintessential modern-day Maharaja, with a portfolio of palaces brimming with taxidermied tigers and sporting trophies, garages full of collectible cars, and stables full of polo ponies and caparisoned elephants. Ignoring warnings about Jai's philanderings, she became his third wife in 1940. Had the British had their way, the marriage would not have taken place. They wanted to veto the marriage because taking a wife who was a non-Rajput princess from Cooch Behar would, the British believe, create unrest between Jaipur and other states in Rajputana. Somewhat puzzlingly, the British described Aisha as a non-Aryan and argued that marriage would therefore deliver a serious blow to Rajput pride of race. Jai, to his credit, stood up to the then Viceroy Lord Lithgow, essentially telling him to mind his own business. For me, the transformation of Aisha from Jai's third wife, forced to conform to the expectations of how a traditional Rajput bride should behave, to being a highly successful politician and woman in her own right, is a remarkable story, given that Jai was not entirely supportive of her move. We glean some of this transformation from her memoir, A Princess Remembers. A self-confessed tomboy from a large and carefree family, Aisha found her introduction to palace life with its arcane tradition and rules of purdah frightening and oppressively formal. First and foremost, she was an outsider. Schooled in England and Switzerland, she spoke French better than she spoke Hindi, danced with the grace of a professional, and rode horses as if she had been bred for the sport. She wore her trademark chiffon saris with the same stylish elan as she wore trousers, while sipping cocktails and smoking her fashionably long cigarettes. Stuck in one of Jaipur's marble palaces, normal conversation was impossible. She pleaded with the women in the zanana who spoke English to talk freely to her, argue with her, to call her Aisha in private. They ignored her requests. Overly protective, Jai forbade her to learn Hindi on the grounds that if she started speaking to one group of women rather than another, rumour or intrigues would start. Instead, she started a school for girls, took up numerous charitable causes, and eventually became a politician. Everybody knows the story of how Aisha won her first electoral contest by such a huge margin it got listed in the Guinness Book of Records. But the story behind it is far more interesting. Going on the hustings meant roughing it and having to converse with her electorate in a language she wasn't fluent in. But she clearly overcame these challenges, nor was she afraid to defend her views. Her success in politics came at a price. It earned her the wrath of Indira Gandhi, who inherited her father's dislike of the princely states. But there was something more personal at play as well. As Khushwant Singh once said, and I quote, "Indira could not stomach a woman who was more good-looking than herself," unquote. To seek her revenge, Indira insulted Aisha in Parliament, sent the taxmen on her, and locked her up during the emergency. Prior to that, of course, came the abolition of the privy purses, which was designed to further undermine India's royal families. While her memoir, A Princess Remember, has been a bestseller for years, it clearly only tells one side of her life story. I've already mentioned her failure to acknowledge her half-sister and the British opposition to her marriage. Both are absent from her memoir. My book also reveals Gayatri Devi's fraught relationship with her elder brother Baya, who became the Maharaja of Kuch Behar and married an English woman, Gina Egan. Aisha doesn't even mention his wife by name in her memoir, and she hardly touches on Baya's tragic death. One of the reasons for this might be because brother and sister were at loggerheads over their mother's inheritance. There's a photo of Aisha and Indira. Indira looks fairly old there. It was probably taken in about the 1940s, possibly in London. Indira had never disclosed the contents of her will to her children and had refused Baya's request for his share of the proceeds from her estate. Most of her private correspondence was also destroyed by Aisha, probably because it could have revealed embarrassing details about her mother's affairs, including possibly with Jai, her husband. An element of mother-daughter rivalry was also at play, with Indira being more liberated than her daughter. Indira had taken on the might of the Raj, which wanted to remove her as regent and cared little about what the public and those in authorities thought of her. Aisha had taken on the Congress Party, a much milder foe, and was more interested in protecting her persona as a politician and a faithful wife. My book also reveals the discontent within the Swatantra Party over her sometimes casual attitude to politics, and much of what went on behind the scenes during her incarceration in Tihar jail. It also brings out for the first time her fraught relationship with her only son, Jagat, the breakup of his marriage and his dreadful descent into alcoholism. Like Baya, he had a domineering mother who took a hands-off approach to his upbringing, which alienated him from his roots and made him look for solace in alcohol, which led to the breakup of his marriage with his Thai wife, Priya. In 1970, Jai died playing polo in England. The vast crowds that turned out for his funeral show that although he'd been stripped from all power, he was still deeply respected by his people. His death was another turning point in the history of the House of Jaipur. As I quote a friend of the family saying, "It all fell apart when Jai died." Jai bequeathed a complicated legacy. He had married 3 wives, fathered 5 children, added to his ancestral properties, and established a network of trusts to manage the family's wealth. He was a disciplinarian with his family. For as long as he was alive, a certain level of harmony and probity was observed, and then the cracks slowly widened. The dispute over who should inherit his estate now spans 3 generations. Here we have a photograph, a rare photograph of at least 2 branches of the family together. There's Bhawani Singh, or Bubbles, sitting down in the foreground. Standing up next to him is Devraj, Gayatri Devi's grandson, and Devraj's sister, Lalitya. Padmini is the lady in the middle there. She's the Rajmata of Jaipur now. Priya, Jagat's Thai wife, is in the red sari, and that's Diya Kumari in the very fetching pink sari. They've more or less settled some of the differences now, but you know, the 3 branches of the family have really been at loggerheads over property, shares, tax liabilities, trusts, and movable wealth such as gold and jewelry for 3 generations now. As one set of litigants dies, their children inherit a poisoned chalice of complex court proceedings that range from the comical to the tragic. Allegations of forged wills, doctored share certificates, non-disclosure of assets, of treasures gone missing, of sick or senile members being made to sign away their fortune, lead all the way up to India's Supreme Court. Let me give you one example of how this breakdown has affected the House of Jaipur. When Aisha and her stepson, Bhawani Singh, there they are together, were imprisoned in Tihar jail by Indira Devi during the emergency, the rest of the family came together and lobbied politicians and heads of state for their release. A decade later, Aisha and Bhawani Singh were shunning each other's company. When Bhawani Singh ran for Congress in 1989, the Lok Sabha, Aisha actively campaigned for his BJP opponent. When Aisha died in aged 18 in 2009, almost 4 decades had elapsed since the House of Jaipur was stripped of all its royal powers, prerogatives, and privileges. Yet thousands turned out for her funeral procession and cried Maharani Ki Jai as it wound its way through the old city of Jaipur to the cremation ground. When centuries-old tradition collide head-on with rapid societal change, instability is inevitable. Laws of primogeniture that once governed successions in princely families no longer apply, but their descendants cling to them nevertheless. A ruler's wealth was once measured in begas of land and the strength of his fortifications. Today, it is hidden in trusts and offshore bank accounts. Throw in ancestral properties, Persian carpets dating back to the Mughal period, precious miniatures and priceless jewels brought back as war booty from the sacking of Kabul, and one has all the ingredients for a long, complex and bitter confluence of disputes. In May 2019, I attended celebrations to mark the 100th anniversary of Aisha's birth, curious to see how Jaipur's most famous royal was being remembered. Reminders of that dignity and grace were evident at an exhibition of photographs entitled A Journey to the Hearts of People at Jaipur's Birla Auditorium, which chronicled her extraordinary life frame by frame. The commemorative program began with her grandson Devraj speaking to a capacity crowd about her legacy, before introducing a phalanx of luminaries and erstwhile Maharajas, each with their own stories of the Rajmata's influence and contributions to society. Later, on that sweltering evening, a colourfully caparisoned elephant greeted hundreds of guests arriving at the Jai Mahal Palace Hotel's gardens for a commemorative dinner. But the celebratory atmosphere was little more than a veneer, an opportunity to pay tribute to Aisha's indisputable legacy regarding the empowerment of women in Rajasthan, her contribution in the area of arts, culture, and fashion, and her stellar political career was not enough to bury differences and bring the extended family together. None of Aisha's stepsons or their families attended the Birla Auditorium or Jai Mahal functions. The only person of any connection to the current royal family who took up Devraj and Lalitia's invitation was Narendra Singh Rajawat, who had recently divorced Dia Kumari, the only child of Bhawani Singh and his wife Padmini. India's princes and princesses once prided themselves on their pedigree and sense of exclusivity. Today, a new social order has arrived, based more on celebrity. In November 2019, one clever headline writer declared Padmanabh Singh, Jaipur's newly crowned Airbnb, after he became the first Indian royal to rent out part of his palace on the accommodation sharing web platform. The one-bedroom Gudlia suite with its own private pool and butler was previously only available to royalty, heads of state, and A-list celebrities. In pre-COVID days, anyone with a spare $8,000 could book it online and sleep in the room Oprah Winfrey once occupied. The royal family now employs a PR agency to ensure that any public appearances serve to enhance rather than detract from the aura they strive to maintain. The royal family is back in the political spotlight, with Dia Kumari winning the Lok Sabha seat of Rajasamund by 5 lakh votes. Present at many of his mother's rallies was Padmanabh Singh, who was controversially adopted by his grandfather to be his heir when he was just 4 years and 4 months old. Like his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, Padmanabh, or Pacho, as he's called by his friends, is a star polo player. His good manners and calm exterior cannot hide the fact that he is the de facto head, at least as far as traditional ranking goes, of a larger family unit that remains deeply split. 3 generations of litigation are spread across 3 branches of his nearest kin, and there is no guarantee that the next generation would not inherit the detritus. Legal cases launched in the mid-80s still clog the courts. In a 2018 ruling by the Delhi High Court on whether the law of primogeniture should apply to Jai's estate, the list of petitioners and respondents was 6 pages long, made up of different combinations of current and deceased members of the family who have fought the case for over 3 decades. More than a dozen advocates were listed as appearing for various parties. Generational change, I believe, is the greatest hope for the House of Jaipur. Princess Dia is making her mark with her charities and educational initiatives, as well as in the political sphere. And Padmanabh looks set to follow his mother's example. Aisha's grandchildren, Devraj and Lalitia, have their Thai ancestry to draw on and are keen to preserve Isadar's heritage and honour their grandmother's legacy. When it comes to settling family feuds, however, time has largely stood still for the Jaipur royals. But in most other respects, the lives of India's princes have been transformed unrecognisably. Today, there are no kingdoms at stake, no borders to protect. With the abolition of the princely states, the stupendous wealth that flowed from their revenues, enabling the royals to buy emeralds the size of hens' eggs or gift their girlfriends diamond tiaras, is gone. Hundreds of business tycoons far outshine the erstwhile princes in opulence and extravagance, notably on display at the lavish weddings they hold for their offspring. The present generation of Jaipur royals, unlike the previous one, no longer run off to the playgrounds of the West to escape their responsibilities at home. They have challenged the old traditions and social order to further the cause of women's rights to promote education and other charitable pursuits. They've become more professional in managing their estates and assets, turning their gilded palaces into luxury hotels. The magnificent forts now house exhibitions of art and sculpture, and the City Palace Museum in Jaipur, overhauled under the family's direction, has become one of the finest in India. In politics, polo ground, and even on the fashion catwalk, the House of Jaipur has begun to map out a new set of traditions, deftly harnessing their royal aura as they reinvent their roles and relevance in 21st century democratic India. Unfortunately, the same can't be said of Hyderabad. When Mukram Jah dies, his eldest son, Azmat, will inherit a meaningless title, but he has had even less of a connection with the erstwhile state than his father did, and he was made Nizam more than a century ago. Thank you very much. That just about ends my talk. I think I've spoken for, brought us up to about an hour into the program. More than happy. I mean, it's obviously a huge topic that I've had to cover, and I've pared it down to its essentials, trying to keep it as contemporary as possible. As I said, I skipped the first, from the second to the sixth generations of the Nizams. I left out a lot of the background to the Jaipur story and all of that. But happy to answer questions, and do please buy the books if you want to find out more.
Sure. Thanks so much, John. That was really, really fascinating. On balance, do you believe that the Jaipur story is one of coming to terms with their current existence, whereas the Hyderabad story is one of not being able to come to terms? Or was the last Nizam just a victim of his circumstances, the age in which he was born?
Yeah, look, very much to a large extent. It is different. I mean, there are obvious similarities. There are numerous court cases still current in Hyderabad that involve the Nizam. They're never going to get resolved in his lifetime. The widow of the man who lent him money back in the 90s is still claiming, is still going to court trying to get that money back from his estate. But look, yeah, there is, and unlike, I mean, Mukram Jah had 5 wives altogether, but and has children from 3 of those unions, but it is a very, very different story. I mean, he is of a different generation, and as I pointed out, he spent very little time in India before he became the Nizam. And he was, he kind of almost, when I met him, didn't hide the fact that he was a bit of a misfit. He said, he told me that he was not raised to become the administrator of what was the remained of a princely state. In terms of the estate that he had to manage, that he was trained to become an engineer in the army. So he told me he couldn't tell the difference between a diamond and a piece of glass. How could he manage an estate that had more jewelry in it than probably owned by all the other princely states put together? So there's very much a difference there. And once he left Australia, once he left India and moved to Australia, he very rarely came back to India. And when he left Australia for good and went to Turkey, his visits to India were even rarer still.
So speaking of Australia, what happened to the sons of, what happened to his 2 sons by the Australian wife?
Yeah. Well, one is still alive. One, unfortunately, died of a drug overdose. I think that's, the fact that this was a very dysfunctional family must have had something to do with that. Maybe the wealth that was there, the money that was available, had a hand in it. But one son is still in Australia and visits his father occasionally.
Okay, staying with Hyderabad, when you showed the pictures of the courts in Hyderabad, the question is, we saw the men who were in Islamic costumes, whereas the wife was in a sari. Any explanation why the wife was also not in a typically Muslim clothing?
I think if you're talking about the coronation photograph.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Well, look, Ezra, Princess Ezra, was Turkish, but Turkey had been and so she was a Muslim, but Turkey has been, as you know, a secular state ever since Ataturk came to power and abolished first the Sultan and then the Caliphate. And again, they were a very cosmopolitan couple. They met in England. She had hardly visited Hyderabad before that coronation. They were married secretly because Mukram Jah's grandfather would have never approved of the marriage had he found out that he was marrying a Turkish woman rather than an Indian bride. So she wasn't. Look, there may have been a specific reason why she was not wearing Hyderabadi dress as Mukram Jah was, wearing the traditional sherwani. But it would be to do with the fact that she, of her Turkish background and the secular nature of that state, which she was brought up in.
Are there any descendants? I wanted to ask you from his uncle's side. I remember you said that his father had a brother. So are there any descendants from that side of the family?
Oh, you're talking about Mukram Jah's brother? Or,
yes.
Yeah, look,
the last
there
Nizam
are
had two sons.
The Mukram Jah had, if you're talking about Mukram Jah rather than Osman Ali Khan, Osman Ali Khan had two sons. Oh, okay, so you're talking about Muazzam there, and who was married to Niloufar.
Okay.
Yeah. No, they didn't have any children.
Okay.
They separated quite. I think in about the 1950s, and she married an American guy, Edmund Pope. They didn't have any children either, and Durshava died in around 2009, and I'm not sure when Niloufar died, but it was earlier than that, I think, much earlier. Yeah.
The question from Bharat is that, was the Razakar movement initiated by the Nizam, or was he a helpless bystander? He's talking about the 1940s.
I think yeah, we haven't. I didn't even mention Operation Polo. The Indian takeover of Hyderabad. That's obviously a chapter in the book and part of the story. But no, I think he was the Nizam was more of a pawn in the hands of the Razakars. Yeah, no, he didn't have any. He didn't have any involvement in setting them up. No.
Oh, I see. Okay. A few months ago, maybe a year ago, there was the newspapers were full of stories about a big sum of money in possession with HSBC Bank, and whether it was due to the Nizams or descendants. 35 million pounds it was.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, that was the NatWest Bank.
Yes.
So back in, and this is a very fascinating story. Yes, and it's only just been resolved. But in 1948, just as Indian troops were about to invade Hyderabad, the Nizam gave his finance minister £1 million. It was £1 million and something, 1,110,000 and so many shillings and so many pence. Anyway, it was an exact amount that was deposited in the Westminster Bank, which is what it was known in those days, and this was, of course, the finance minister then went to Pakistan, and there was and the Nizam was actually paying. The money was ostensibly supposed to be used to buy arms to bolster Hyderabad's defences in anticipation of an Indian invasion. And in fact, it's an interesting sideline is that the Nizam employed an Australian gun runner, Sydney Cotton, to fly Lancaster bombers, ex-World War II Lancaster bombers full of ammunition from Karachi into Hyderabad. Anyway, that money became the subject of a three-way dispute between the government of India, the government of Pakistan, and the Nizam's family, namely Mukram Jah, as to who was the rightful owner of that money. And that money sat in this account and accrued interest, and I'm not exactly sure what it was worth, but it came to roundabout to, as you say, 40 million pounds over the 70 years or so that it sat in that account. And there was numerous attempts to court cases, and it would have been millions spent in lawyer and court fees alone to resolve this case. But finally, it was resolved in favour of the Nizam's family, and that was just a few months ago. Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about powerful women. Gayatri Devi, shining example. But her mother, Indira Devi, was also I wouldn't say famous, but she had a tinge of notoriety to it. I'm reading this book on the Travancore royals just now, and the author writes somewhat disapprovingly that Indira Devi was somewhat of a bad influence on the very pious, dedicated, temple-going Maharani of Travancore. So the question from Bharat is, who was it that really stopped the practice of Parda? Was it Indira Devi or her mother Chimnabai of Baroda?
Chimnabai was a very liberated woman as well, yeah. So she didn't go around in Purdah. She was Sayagyi Rao's only wife. He was unique among Indian princes of only having one wife. She supported women's education, and they travelled to Europe together and so on. So Indira definitely got her ideas about what should be the role of women, both in royal families and in the wider society, from her mother. And then Gayatri Devi inherited that from her mother, Indira Devi. But yeah, so it comes right down the line.
So the last question is the Jaipur book out, and is it available in India?
Oh, absolutely. It's been out for about 3 months now.
All right.
And I think you can get it through Amazon or Flipkart and all those things. Yeah.
So the question from Nikhil is that there are two covers with the same title, The Last Nizam, by you obviously. The one which is displayed on the screen is not available in Amazon in India, and the one which is available has a couple on the cover. So are they different editions for different countries, or what is it?
No. It was. Look, thanks for pointing that out, because I checked with the publisher, but no, this was a new edition of the book came out last year, and with a new preface. So this is the new. I mean, other than that, the text is pretty much the same. But no, this is simply a sort of rebirthed, if you like, a version of that original book. But it's funny. Amazon should be selling this edition, not the other one. Yeah.
Okay. Staying with royals, I want to inform John and of course our audience that we're going to have a talk very soon by descendants of the erstwhile royal family of Sawantwadi. Sawantwadi is a small erstwhile principality between Maharashtra and Goa, and the descendants are going to talk about how they're reviving their local crafts. Sawantwadi was known for its wooden toys and games. And coincidentally, Gayatri Devi and Satyashila Devi of Sawantwadi are cousins or were cousins.
Ah,
So um,
ah.
you should attend that talk, John, if you can, from
Yeah,
Australia.
yeah, yeah. No, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there are lots and lots of appreciative comments about the sweep of the talk, about how informative it was. So, yes, an important aspect of our lives in India, somewhat venerated, looked up to, in ridiculed in some quarters, but very much part of our history, these royals of ours, of all the 543 states. Um,
yes.
Thank you so much, John. It was really informative. I have one announcement before I request Bharat to say a few words. That is the following, that heritage is definitely about intangible heritage, but we got to stand up and take notice when our tangible heritage takes a hit, as is happening with the beautiful Banganga district in Bombay. The tank, which is amongst the oldest inhabited areas of Mumbai, is taking a beating. The waters are suddenly turning murky because of unplanned construction activity around the tank. So Khaki has started a petition, and we ask that you take part in that petition, put your signatures, let your voices be heard, so that jointly we can save this very important aspect of our city's built heritage.